Shrapnel had ripped through Sergeant First Class Dwayne O'Connor's abdomen nearly 3 hours earlier. Blood soaked every layer of his combat uniform, yet he still fought with the ferocity of a cornered predator. 3 combat medics had already tried to restrain him. All 3 had failed. He refused pain medication, refused treatment, and refused to let anyone decide how he would die. Then she walked into the triage tent. The struggle stopped. For a single, impossible moment, Dwayne simply stared. He recognized her face. He recognized the legend. First Lieutenant Aileen Cruz lowered her hands into the freezing basin of iodine-stained water. The sharp antiseptic smell mixed with dust, diesel fumes, and the metallic scent of fresh blood. Outside, the rhythmic pounding of an incoming UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter shook the reinforced canvas walls of Forward Operating Base Kestrel in northern Syria. Another casualty evacuation. Another night that promised more wounded than the medical team could possibly handle. Aileen never looked toward the entrance. She had spent 4 relentless years training herself not to react whenever helicopter blades thundered overhead or sirens screamed across the base. Panic wasted precious seconds. Calm saved lives. She carefully scrubbed each finger, rinsed away the crimson stains left from the previous surgery, and dried her hands with practiced precision. Beneath the harsh fluorescent lights hanging from the tent ceiling, her expression remained perfectly unreadable. Outside, organized chaos erupted. Stretchers bounced over loose gravel. Orders echoed through the darkness. Generators hummed beneath the roar of aircraft engines while exhausted corpsmen rushed from one casualty to another. Inside Trauma Bay 1, however, everything seemed strangely still. Aileen waited. She carried a nickname that followed her everywhere, one she hated with every fiber of her being: the Angel of Death. 3 years earlier, while serving at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, 5 critically wounded soldiers had died during her overnight shifts inside the intensive care unit. Every one of them had been expected to survive. The deaths shocked the nation. Television commentators demanded answers. Military investigators questioned every medication she touched. Online rumors transformed an experienced trauma nurse into a monster. Some accused her of murdering wounded soldiers out of misplaced compassion. Others claimed she had secretly become a serial killer hiding behind a military uniform. For nearly 12 exhausting months, Aileen endured hearings, interrogations, and a military tribunal that dissected every second of her career. The final investigation revealed the horrifying truth. A defective manufacturing batch of intravenous potassium had contaminated multiple treatment stations. The medication, not the nurse, had silently triggered fatal cardiac arrests. She was completely cleared, officially innocent. But courtroom verdicts rarely erase public suspicion. The whispers continued in hospital corridors. Conversations stopped whenever she entered a room. Some people still looked at her with fear instead of respect. Unable to escape the reputation, Aileen volunteered for frontline combat medicine, choosing the harsh realities of war over the quiet judgment of military hospitals back home. At least bullets never lied. Priority 1 incoming. Specialist Miller shouted as he threw open the tent flap. 2 combat medics burst inside, wrestling with a stretcher that seemed determined to escape their control. The patient was enormous. His body armor had been cut away, exposing shredded fabric soaked in dark, nearly black blood. Fresh crimson dripped from the side of the stretcher, leaving a trail across the concrete floor. Sergeant First Class Dwayne O'Connor, Delta Force, Task Force 71, one of the military's most experienced operators. But unlike most critically wounded patients, Dwayne wasn't unconscious. He wasn't drifting toward shock. He was terrifyingly alert. His pale gray eyes darted around the room with predatory awareness, searching every face for danger. Specialist Miller uncapped a morphine syringe and leaned closer. "I'm giving you something for the pain." Dwayne exploded into motion. His hand shot forward with astonishing speed, clamping around Miller's wrist like a steel vise. With one violent twist, the medic cried out as the syringe flew across the room, shattering against a cabinet. "Get away from me," Dwayne roared, his voice cracked from blood loss yet filled with unmistakable authority. The nylon restraints stretched across his chest groaned under the force of his struggle. Corporal Jenkins immediately pressed fresh combat gauze against the massive abdominal wound. "Sergeant, you've got multiple shrapnel wounds and a ruptured femoral artery," Jenkins pleaded. "You're bleeding out. We need fluids, blood, and sedation now," I said. Dwayne growled through clenched teeth. "Back off." With his remaining strength, he kicked outward. The impact sent Jenkins crashing into a stainless steel instrument table. Scalpels, clamps, and surgical scissors scattered across the floor with a deafening metallic crash. Everyone froze. Dwayne's breathing came in ragged gasps. Sweat streamed down his face. His skin had turned the pale gray color every combat medic recognized as the beginning of irreversible hemorrhagic shock. Adrenaline alone kept him conscious. He understood exactly how badly he was wounded. He also seemed determined to meet death on his own terms. Without speaking, Aileen stepped away from the scrub station. Her movements were slow, controlled, almost unnaturally calm. She raised one hand toward Miller and Jenkins. "Stand down." Neither medic argued. Both immediately stepped back, grateful to surrender the impossible patient. Aileen approached the stretcher until she stood beside Dwayne. He glared up at her, muscles still tense, one blood-covered hand hovering instinctively near the empty holster that had already been secured outside the tent. For several silent seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the rage disappeared from Dwayne's face. His breathing slowed. Recognition replaced fury. The hardened Delta operator, who moments earlier had fought everyone in the room, stared into Aileen Cruz's eyes with stunned disbelief. He knew exactly who she was. The instant Dwayne's eyes locked onto her face, something changed. The savage defiance that had fueled his violent struggle faded. The wild panic burning behind his eyes sharpened into something far more unsettling. Recognition. His body slowly relaxed against the stretcher. The restraints no longer strained beneath his strength. His breathing, moments earlier little more than animalistic gasps, settled into slow, painful breaths that rattled deep inside his chest. "I know you," he whispered. His voice was suddenly fragile, as though the adrenaline keeping him alive had finally begun to surrender. "I saw your picture during the trial." Aileen didn't react. "My name is Lieutenant Cruz," she said evenly as she pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. The sharp snap of latex echoed through the suddenly silent trauma bay. "I'm the lead trauma nurse assigned to this facility." A faint, humorless smile tugged at Dwayne's bloodless lips. "Cruz." He coughed violently, a wet, painful sound that left crimson flecks across his chin. "The Angel of Death." His exhausted eyes studied her face. "So they sent the Grim Reaper to FOB Kestrel." Aileen reached for a pair of heavy trauma shears without the slightest change in expression. "You can call me whatever you like, Sergeant." Her voice remained calm, almost cold. "But right now you're bleeding into your abdominal cavity at nearly a pint every few minutes. If I don't expose that wound and clamp the damaged artery, you won't survive long enough to explain why you tried to break my medic's wrist. I'm not letting them put that poison in me." His words came through clenched teeth. He nodded weakly toward the shattered morphine syringe lying across the floor. "I'd rather bleed out." Aileen stepped closer until she was standing directly over him. "You want to die?" Her eyes never left his. For several long seconds, neither of them blinked. Finally, Dwayne answered, "No." The single word escaped as little more than a breath. "I want to live." His trembling hand reached upward, stained dark with his own blood. Weak fingers caught the collar of her scrub top and gently pulled her closer. "But if they hook me up to those 4 bags," his voice cracked, "I'll be dead anyway." Aileen remained perfectly still, just like the rest of my squad. The temperature inside the trauma bay suddenly seemed to drop. She searched his face carefully. Years of emergency medicine had taught her how to recognize hallucinations, traumatic brain injuries, oxygen deprivation, and hemorrhagic confusion. This wasn't any of them. Despite the agony etched across his features, Dwayne's eyes were crystal clear. He wasn't rambling. He believed every word he was saying. The heart monitor attached to his finger interrupted the silence with frantic electronic beeps. His blood pressure continued to collapse. His pulse climbed higher. Time was running out. Without speaking, Aileen carefully loosened his grip from her uniform. Miller. Jenkins. Her eyes never left the patient. Outside. The two medics hesitated. Lieutenant, he needs immediate, I said outside. Her voice cracked through the room like rifle fire. And secure the tent flap. Neither man argued again. They exchanged uneasy glances before disappearing into the night, sealing the heavy canvas behind them. Silence returned. Now only two people remained inside the trauma bay. A combat nurse haunted by a reputation she never deserved, and a Delta Force operator convinced that accepting treatment would guarantee his death. Aileen moved quickly to the equipment cart. Ignoring the standard force supplies prepared by the medics, she reached beneath the table and lifted a rapid infusion cooler packed with freshly donated whole blood collected from the base's walking blood bank only hours earlier. Blood that had never passed through the central military supply chain. She looked back at Dwayne. Start talking. Her tone was firm. Why are you convinced the medication they're giving you is going to kill you? Dwayne squeezed his eyes shut as another wave of agony tore through his shattered abdomen. My team. He struggled for air before continuing. We were ambushed near the border. He swallowed hard. Standard patrol. Another painful breath. We took casualties. Nothing we couldn't handle. Dwayne struggled to pull air into his battered lungs. Every breath rattled through his chest, and every word seemed to cost him another ounce of strength. Our medic stabilized two of my guys. His voice trembled. He gave them standard field morphine and normal saline from the new medical shipment. Without interrupting him, Aileen inserted a large-bore needle into the vein of his left arm with practiced precision. Instead of reaching for the hanging 4 bags prepared by the medics, she connected the line directly to a unit of freshly donated whole blood from the base's walking blood bank. Dwayne watched every movement. His eyes followed the tubing from the blood bag to his arm. Only after realizing it hadn't come from the regular supply rack did the tension finally leave his muscles. For the first time since entering the trauma tent, he allowed someone to treat him without resistance. And then, Aileen asked quietly. She packed layers of quick-clot combat gauze deep into the jagged abdominal wound. Her hands worked with mechanical efficiency while applying relentless pressure to slow the bleeding. Dwayne cried out, his back arching against the stretcher. Several agonizing seconds passed before he found enough breath to continue. 3 minutes later, he swallowed hard. They were both dead. The words barely escaped his lips. Not from the gunshots. His eyelids squeezed shut as another wave of pain washed over him. They started convulsing. Heart stopped. Foam around the mouth. His eyes opened again. The same way. He stared directly at Aileen. They said your patients died. For an instant, her hands froze. The memories she had spent years burying crashed back without warning. Monitor alarm screaming. Flat lines stretching endlessly across glowing screens. Doctors rushing into intensive care rooms already too late. Faces of soldiers she had fought desperately to save. The investigation. The accusations. The endless whispers. She forced herself back to the present. What happened next, she asked. Our medic tried checking the medication. Dwayne's breathing grew shallower as blood loss continued draining his strength despite the transfusion. He never made it. His jaw tightened. Sniper got him before he reached the supply cases. A painful cough interrupted him. But I saw the shipment earlier that morning. His voice had become little more than a whisper. I memorized the lot numbers. He looked toward the rack of untouched 4 bags. They matched the shipment delivered here 2 days ago. Eileen's thoughts accelerated. 2 days earlier, Forward Operating Base Kestrel had received an emergency medical resupply flown directly from Regional Logistics Command. The entire operation had been supervised personally by Captain Gage Watson. Watson. Ambitious. Smooth-talking. Always smiling. Always finding reasons to bypass inventory procedures. More than once, he had dismissed Eileen's insistence on verifying medical shipments before distribution. At the time, She had assumed he simply wanted efficiency. Now the pieces began falling into place. "Why?" she asked quietly, while tightening a combat tourniquet high on Dwayne's injured thigh to reduce the arterial bleeding until surgery. "Why sabotage medical supplies?" Dwayne's eyelids fluttered. "Money." The word was almost inaudible. "Watson." Another shallow breath. He sold real military pharmaceuticals through black market channels. His fingers twitched weakly against the blanket. "Replace them with counterfeit drugs. Cheap copies. Mixed with lethal chemicals. No one notices missing inventory." He reached out with a trembling, blood-covered hand and wrapped his fingers around Eileen's wrist. "I refused treatment." His grip weakened. "I didn't know who I could trust." Eileen looked down at him. "But when you walked in..." A faint smile appeared on his exhausted face. "I knew." She raised an eyebrow. "You trusted the angel of death?" Bitterness crept into her voice despite herself. Dwayne managed a tired, crooked grin. "They blamed you once for poison medication." His breathing slowed. "I figured you'd never let it happen again. You'd recognize it." Eileen released his hand and turned toward the medication cart. Rows of perfectly labeled morphine vials sat beside hanging saline bags. Everything looked authentic. She picked up one sealed vial, drew a small sample into a sterile syringe, and placed a single drop onto a portable chemical test strip used to verify degraded battlefield medications. Normally, the strip remained pale yellow. Instead, it turned black. Not dark, black. The violent reaction spread across the testing pad almost instantly. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't morphine. It was a powerful synthetic neurotoxin disguised inside professionally counterfeited packaging. Injected into wounded soldiers, it would trigger catastrophic cardiac failure within minutes. Doctors would assume the deaths resulted from severe combat injuries. No one would question the medication. No one except someone who had already lived through the same nightmare. Cold fury settled deep inside Eileen's chest. Walter Reed had nearly destroyed her career. Now someone had transformed that tragedy into the perfect battlefield murder scheme. Before she could say another word, the heavy canvas flap burst open. Standing confidently in the entrance was Captain Gage Watson. His uniform was spotless. Not a speck of dust. Not a stain of blood. Behind him stood two armed military police officers, their hands resting near their weapons as Watson slowly surveyed the trauma bay with an unreadable smile. Captain Gage Watson's eyes swept across the trauma bay with practiced precision. First, he noticed the shattered syringe lying beside the overturned instrument tray. Then his gaze shifted to the untouched 4 bags still hanging from the stainless steel pole. Finally, his cold, calculating eyes settled on First Lieutenant Eileen Cruz. His smile was polished. His eyes were not. "Lieutenant Cruz," Watson said smoothly, as though he had just entered a routine briefing instead of a blood-soaked combat hospital. "I was informed we have an aggressive, uncooperative patient refusing medical treatment." He stepped farther into Trauma Bay 1. Step away from Sergeant O'Connor. His tone left no room for discussion. "The sergeant is being transferred immediately for medical evacuation. My team will oversee the remainder of his treatment." For several silent seconds, Eileen said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the chemical test strip hidden inside her palm. Only moments earlier, it had transformed from pale yellow to an impossible, terrifying black after coming into contact with the supposed morphine. Proof. Not suspicion. Proof. She looked toward Dwayne. His eyelids fluttered weakly. Fresh, whole blood continued flowing into his arm, but his pulse remained dangerously unstable. His breathing had become shallow, uneven, and frighteningly slow. He was balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. And she suddenly understood something with absolute certainty. She was the only person standing between a wounded American soldier and an execution disguised as emergency medical care. Without breaking eye contact, Eileen slipped the test strip into the pocket of her scrub top. "I'm afraid that's impossible, Captain." Her voice dropped into a calm, icy register that silenced the room. "The sergeant is critically unstable." She pressed harder against the quick-clot dressing packed deep into Dwayne's abdominal wound. He doesn't leave this table until I authorize it, and I haven't even begun definitive treatment. The pleasant expression disappeared from Watson's face. The courteous logistics officer vanished. In his place stood a man whose patience had finally reached its limit. He walked deeper beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, his polished boots clicking sharply against the blood-stained concrete floor. Behind him came 2 military police officers. They remained close enough to act immediately, their hands hovering uneasily near their holstered sidearms. Aileen never moved. She planted herself directly between Watson and the stretcher. Behind her, the rapid transfusion system continued delivering fresh whole blood into Dwayne's failing circulatory system. Each drop purchased another precious second. Nothing more. "Lieutenant Cruz," Watson said quietly, "you are crossing a very dangerous line. This soldier participated in a classified operation. My office has full authority over his extraction and all subsequent medical handling." His eyes narrowed. "Step aside." Eileen's expression never changed. "Your authority ends where my trauma bay begins." The words were calm, unshakable. Military protocol prohibits the transfer of an unstable casualty without clearance from the attending trauma surgeon. She gestured toward the operating wing beyond the canvas walls. "Major Reynolds is currently performing emergency surgery on 2 critical patients, until he personally signs a transfer order." She looked directly into Watson's eyes. "Sergeant O'Connor remains my patient." A tense silence settled over the room. Watson's jaw tightened. His eyes drifted briefly toward the untouched saline bags, then to the broken syringe resting in a puddle of iodine and saline. He understood immediately. She knew. Whatever secret he had buried inside those medical shipments was no longer hidden. Without taking his eyes off Aileen, Watson addressed the military police. "Corporals." Both men straightened instantly. "Secure the patient for transport." His voice turned cold. "If Lieutenant Cruz interferes." He paused. "Place her under arrest for insubordination and mutiny in a combat zone." The 2 young MPs exchanged uncertain glances. Neither wanted to arrest a combat trauma nurse while she fought to save a dying soldier. Every instinct told them something was terribly wrong. Yet Watson outranked them. Reluctantly, they stepped forward. "Stop." Eileen's command cracked across the trauma bay like a rifle shot. Both MPs froze. Without hesitation, she reached to the Mayo stand and lifted a heavy stainless steel surgical clamp. She didn't point it at anyone. She simply held it firmly at her side. "If either of you disconnect this blood transfusion." Her voice remained frighteningly controlled. "Sergeant O'Connor will bleed to death before you reach the helipad." She nodded toward the tubing carrying fresh blood into his arm. "This transfusion is the only reason his heart is still beating." Her eyes locked onto the young military policeman. "If you remove it," she let the silence linger, "you won't be carrying out a lawful order. You'll be participating in the murder of a United States soldier." The word murder settled over the trauma bay like freezing smoke. Neither MP moved. Neither reached for the transfusion line. Watson saw doubt spreading across their faces. He could not afford hesitation. "Outside," he barked, barely containing his anger. "Secure the perimeter. No one enters this tent without my authorization." The 2 MPs reluctantly obeyed. As the heavy canvas flap closed behind them, only 3 people remained inside the trauma bay. A dying Delta Force operator, a combat nurse with evidence hidden in her pocket, and the man who now realized she knew exactly what he had done. "I'll speak to the lieutenant myself." Captain Gage Watson's voice was calm, almost reassuring. The 2 military police officers exchanged relieved glances. Neither wanted to be caught between a commanding officer and a combat trauma nurse. They stepped outside without another word, pulling the heavy canvas flap closed behind them. Instantly, the sounds of the forward operating base became distant and muffled. The thunder of helicopter rotors, the rumble of diesel generators, the shouted commands of medics rushing casualties through the night. Everything faded into a dull roar beyond the canvas walls. Inside the trauma bay, an oppressive silence settled over the room. Watson released a slow sigh, adopting the expression of a disappointed mentor. You've made this far more difficult than it needed to be, Aileen. As he spoke, he casually unbuttoned his uniform jacket. The movement seemed harmless, until it revealed the holstered sidearm resting at his hip. He wasn't drawing the weapon. He didn't need to. The message was unmistakable. He still held the power. You are making a terrible mistake, he continued, deliberately using her first name. The infamous Angel of Death. His smile was thin. The military only kept you around because they were desperate for experienced medical personnel. He took another slow step closer. Do you honestly believe anyone will take your word over mine? A decorated logistics commander. Or a nurse whose name is forever tied to one of the biggest medical scandals in Army history? Aileen didn't flinch. They didn't believe me at Walter Reed. Her voice remained perfectly steady. But they'll believe evidence. She slowly withdrew the chemical test strip from her pocket. Its surface remained stained a deep, unmistakable black. I tested your morphine. She held it where he could see it. It's contaminated with a synthetic neurotoxin. Her eyes narrowed. I know you've been replacing legitimate pharmaceuticals with counterfeit drugs. You sold the real supplies through the black market. And American soldiers paid for your theft with their lives. Watson stared at the test strip for a long moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't nervous. It was cold. You always were smarter than the others, Cruz. He folded his arms. But intelligence isn't the same as vision. He glanced toward the canvas ceiling. This war consumes billions of dollars every year. His voice carried no guilt. No matter how many soldiers you save, they'll eventually be sent back into another firefight. He shrugged. I simply redirected resources to places where they actually held value. You murdered Sergeant O'Connor's teammates. Eileen's words cut through the room. You poisoned American soldiers. Watson's expression barely changed. Casualties of war. He dismissed the accusation with a casual shrug. Nothing more. Then a slow smile spread across his face. And speaking of casualties, he reached into his pocket. When his hand emerged, it held another factory-sealed syringe. The label read morphine sulfate. With deliberate calm, he bit off the protective cap and let it fall onto the blood-stained floor. Eileen's muscles tightened. You're actually going to inject him? Watson smiled. Oh, yes. He rolled the syringe between his fingers. When his heart stops, his eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. I'll call the military police back inside. They'll discover the Angel of Death standing over yet another dead American hero. His smile widened. I'll testify that the pressure finally broke you, that your old habits returned. The court-martial will be quick. Dishonorable discharge. Life in Leavenworth. He tilted his head slightly. The media already knows your story. They'll love this ending. Without warning, Watson lunged. His hands slammed into Eileen's chest. The force sent her stumbling backward into the stainless steel instrument table. The tray overturned. Scalpels, forceps, retractors, surgical clamps. Dozens of instruments crashed across the concrete floor in a deafening explosion of steel. Before Aileen could recover, Watson reached the stretcher. He lifted the poison syringe toward Dwayne O'Connor's exposed intravenous line. Then, everything stopped. A massive hand, slick with blood, shot upward. Dwayne's fingers wrapped around Watson's wrist with crushing force. The captain's arm froze in midair. Dwayne's face was ghostly pale. His breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. Yet his eyes still burned with the relentless determination that had carried him through countless combat missions. Not. He struggled to force the words through clenched teeth. Today. Watson grunted, twisting violently in an attempt to free himself. Nothing happened. Even after catastrophic blood loss, the Delta Force operator's grip felt like forged steel. Years of elite training and an unbreakable will had given him strength that defied reason. Let go, you stubborn fool. Watson snarled. Unable to free his trapped arm, he raised his other fist, drawing it back to strike the wounded sergeant across the face with all the force he could muster. Before Watson's fist could crash into Dwayne's face, Aileen exploded into motion. She pushed herself off the floor with every ounce of strength she had. She ignored the scattered scalpels and surgical clamps littering the concrete. Instead, she reached for the manual defibrillator sitting beside the crash cart. In one fluid movement, she seized the heavy paddles. Watson had only enough time to glance over his shoulder. Clear. Aileen drove both paddles hard into his ribcage and pressed the discharge buttons. A violent surge of electricity ripped through Watson's body. His back arched instantly. Every muscle locked in a brutal spasm as a strangled scream echoed through the trauma bay. The force hurled him backward. He crashed through a folding privacy screen before slamming into shelves stacked with medical supplies. Boxes burst open, instruments scattered across the floor, and the poisoned syringe flew from his hand, skidding beneath a cabinet deep in the corner of the tent. Dwayne's grip finally released. His arm dropped heavily onto the stretcher. He struggled to draw a breath, a faint, blood-stained smile appearing despite the agony. Not exactly. He coughed painfully. Gentle bedside manner. The weak joke barely escaped his lips before his eyes rolled back. His body went limp. The heart monitor instantly changed its rhythm. Aileen threw the defibrillator paddles aside without another thought and rushed back to the stretcher. The monitor shrieked in one continuous alarm. His heart rate was collapsing. The effort of stopping Watson had pushed his battered body beyond its limits. "Stay with me." She pressed trembling fingers against his neck. The pulse was barely there. "Come on, Sergeant." Her hands moved with lightning speed, beginning chest compressions while adjusting the blood transfusion line with practiced precision. Across the room, Watson groaned. The electrical shock had left him dazed, but years of military training quickly took over. He forced himself onto one knee, then another. His vision steadied. The hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. Slowly, he reached for the holster at his hip. The familiar weight of his Beretta M9 settled into his hand. "You crazy witch," he hissed, breathing hard as he chambered a round. The pistol rose toward Eileen's back. "You're both dead." "I wouldn't pull that trigger, Captain." The deep voice rolled through the trauma bay like thunder. Watson froze. He slowly turned toward the entrance. Standing beneath the torn canvas flap was Colonel David Harrison, commander of Forward Operating Base Kestrel. His face was carved from stone. Behind him stood 4 mud-covered Delta Force operators from Task Force 71. They had returned directly from the ambush site. Their suppressed rifles were already shouldered. Brilliant red laser that's covered Watson's chest, throat, and forehead. Every operator stood perfectly still, perfectly ready. "Drop the weapon, Gage." Colonel Harrison's voice carried absolute authority. "Drop it now." A dangerous silence followed. "Or my men will cut you in half." Watson's confidence vanished. His hand began to tremble. He looked at the rifles, then at Harrison. Finally, his eyes drifted toward Aileen. She never even turned around. She ignored the gun entirely. Her entire world had narrowed to the dying soldier beneath her hands. She counted compressions aloud, refusing to surrender. Watson slowly released the pistol. It struck the concrete with a sharp metallic clang. The Delta operators moved instantly. In a blur of coordinated violence, they slammed Watson face first onto the floor, ripped the weapon away, and secured his wrists with heavy-duty tactical restraints. Within seconds, the corrupt captain was completely helpless. Colonel Harrison stepped farther into the trauma bay. His eyes swept across the destruction. The shattered syringe, the untouched 4 bags, the overturned equipment, the frightened silence, and finally, the combat nurse still fighting with everything she had to keep one soldier alive. "Colonel," Aileen never paused her compressions. "I need Major Reynolds now." Her voice cracked with urgency. "Cardiac arrest. The femoral artery is destroyed. I need the surgical team immediately." "Major Reynolds is already running this way," Harrison answered. He stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "Lieutenant." His voice softened. "How did you know?" Aileen delivered another series of compressions before answering. "Sergeant O'Connor warned me." She reached for the ventilation bag. "I tested the morphine." Her eyes never left her patient. It was poisoned. She forced another breath into Dwayne's lungs. Watson admitted everything. He replaced legitimate pharmaceuticals with counterfeit drugs and sold the real supplies through the black market. Colonel Harrison slowly turned toward the disgraced captain as the Delta operators hauled him to his feet. The horror on the commander's face wasn't directed at Watson alone. It was directed at the realization that one corrupt officer had transformed the base's own medical system into the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. Is it true? Colonel Harrison's voice was quiet, but it carried enough authority to silence everyone in the trauma bay. He stared directly at Captain Gage Watson. "Did you poison your own soldiers?" Watson slowly lifted his head. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth where he had struck the floor. He glared at Harrison with open contempt, but said nothing. The silence was answer enough. Before anyone else could speak, one of the Delta Force operators stepped forward. "We heard everything, sir." The operator tapped the communications headset beneath his helmet. Lieutenant Cruz activated her medical radio before the confrontation. He looked toward Aileen with unmistakable respect. The entire conversation was broadcast across the tactical command net. Every medic, every communications operator, every officer wearing an earpiece across forward operating base Kestrel had heard Watson confess to replacing life-saving medications with counterfeit drugs and profiting from the deaths of American soldiers. Aileen allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. When Watson had dismissed the military police, she had quietly pressed the emergency broadcast switch clipped to her chest rig. She had hoped someone would be listening. They all had. Colonel Harrison's expression hardened. "Get him out of my sight." His voice was filled with disgust. "Place Captain Watson in maximum security confinement." He looked directly at the Delta operators. "He's going to Leavenworth." Without hesitation, they dragged the disgraced officer from the tent. Watson struggled only once before realizing it was hopeless. The canvas flap swung closed behind them. Almost immediately it opened again. Major Reynolds burst inside, followed by a full surgical team pushing a sterile operating cart. "I've got him." The chief trauma surgeon moved directly to Dwayne's bedside. Cruz stepped back. His team surrounded the stretcher with practiced precision. Fresh instruments appeared. Monitors were reconnected. Orders flew across the room. The controlled chaos of battlefield surgery resumed. For the first time since the helicopter had landed, Aileen stepped away. She looked down at her trembling hands. They were covered in blood. Her breathing came in uneven, exhausted gasps. Every muscle in her body ached. She watched silently as the surgical team fought for Dwayne's life. There was nothing more she could do, and somehow that was enough. For 3 long years, she had carried the invisible weight of Walter Reed. The accusations, the whispers, the suspicious glances, the cruel nickname she never deserved. The Angel of Death. Standing inside that desert trauma bay, she felt those ghosts finally begin to loosen their grip. Tonight, she hadn't taken a life. She had protected one. 3 weeks later, bright summer sunlight reflected across the runway at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The enormous cargo ramp of a C-17 Globemaster slowly lowered with a deep hydraulic hum, revealing what had become a flying intensive care unit transporting wounded service members back home. Captain Aileen Cruz stood waiting near the foot of the aircraft. Her uniform was immaculate. A new pair of captain's bars rested proudly on her collar. Following the investigation, Central Command had officially cleared her of every lingering suspicion connected to the Walter Reed tragedy. Her actions at FOB Kestrel had exposed an extensive criminal operation inside the military supply chain. Captain Gage Watson now faced court-martial on charges that included murder, fraud, conspiracy, and treason. The poison medication, the chemical test strip, the recorded communications broadcast. Together they formed overwhelming evidence. 2 Air Force medics carefully guided a wheelchair down the aircraft ramp. Its occupant looked thinner than before. His face carried fresh scars, but his eyes were alive, bright, alert. Sergeant First Class Dwayne O'Connor had survived. As the wheelchair reached the tarmac, he lifted one hand. The medic stopped. He looked up at Aileen. A genuine smile spread across his face. "I heard they promoted you." "They did." Aileen answered with a warm smile. "And I heard you're finally headed home." Dwayne chuckled softly. "Medical retirement." He glanced toward the waiting transport bus. "Montana sounds a lot quieter than Syria. You've earned the peace. I think I've dodged enough bullets for one lifetime." They shared a quiet laugh. After a moment, Dwayne extended his hand. Aileen took it. His grip was weaker than before, but it was steady. "Alive." "Thank you," he said quietly. The humor faded from his face. "You saved my life." She gently shook her head. "You saved mine first." He looked confused. "You trusted me." For a long second, neither of them spoke. Then Dwayne smiled. "My grandfather used to say something." Aileen waited. "If you're going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He squeezed her hand gently. "It's good to have someone beside you who isn't afraid of it." Aileen watched as the medics wheeled him toward the transport bus. He looked back once and raised a hand in farewell. She returned the gesture. The bus disappeared into the shimmering afternoon heat. Aileen turned toward the military hospital. Her shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. The legend of the Angel of Death had finally been laid to rest in the Syrian desert. In its place stood something far stronger. A leader, a protector, a combat nurse whose courage had restored not only a soldier's life, but her own honor.